The musicological spark which lit the fuse that you now see, blazing or probably sputtering before you, was a comment from 2002 by Jeremy Dibble of Durham University. Professor Dibble, best known for having been the biographer of both the composers in my talk's title, has complained with considerable justice about lazy invocations of, and I quote, Parry and Stanford, the English musical Renaissance's answer to Marx and Spencer, unquote. When the BBC selected its Composer of the Week in January 1984, it chose both Parry and Stanford, with the implication that neither composer was worthy of commemoration on his own. In truth, the pairing of Parry and Stanford as, so to speak, conjoined twins remains one of the most durable cliches to be found in the whole of musical historiography. Admittedly, such a conjunction isn't unique. As recently as 1966, the Master Musicians series of monographs shoehorned Bruckner and Mahler into the same volume. And it's perhaps too much to expect that the terrible simplifiers, if I may cite the expressive phrase of Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt, would hesitate to lump Parry and Stanford together. But merely because a decision could well have been inevitable doesn't stop it from being regrettable. My purpose today is not to wring my hands in anguish at glib equations of Parry with Stanford. That's next week. Rather, my purpose is to ask three questions. First, when did these equations of Parry with Stanford begin? Second, who bears the major responsibility for such equations? And third, what, if anything, was there in the philosophies of both men to warrant such equations? If we look at what was being said about both men while they were still alive, we find surprisingly few attempts to pair them off. What we do find are determined attempts by their adversaries back then not to treat Parry and Stanford as if they were blood brothers standing apart from fellow composers, but rather to treat them in connection with the now largely neglected Sir Alexander Mackenzie. Instead of conjoined twins, we have, so to speak, conjoined triplets. And this assumption, like so many truly bad ideas, from eugenics to Stalinism, owes a great deal of its fame and vitality to the mischief-making eloquence of George Bernard Shaw. It's well known that Shaw regarded Parry, Stanford and Mackenzie as an upper-crust Protestant mutual admiration society, forever plotting in dark corners to do down the self-educated and Catholic-nurtured Elgar. The best known of Shaw's attacks on the three composers is the one which dates from October 1891. It has been quoted ad nauseam in magazines and textbooks, not to mention in Sir Michael Holroyd's official 4-volume Shaw biography, as if it were the last word on the topic. Shaw included these sentences in a hostile review of Stanford's new oratorio. Who am I that I should be believed, Shaw wrote, to the disparagement of eminent musicians. If you doubt that Eden is a masterpiece, ask Dr. Parry and Dr. Mackenzie, and they will applaud it to the skies. Surely Dr. Mackenzie's opinion is conclusive, for is he not the composer of Veni Creator, guaranteed as excellent music by Professor Stanford and Dr. Parry? You want to know who Parry is? Why, the composer of Blessed Pair of Sirens, as to the merits of which you only have to consult Dr. Mackenzie and Professor Stanford. Unquote. Even Shaw's use of prenominals is weaponized. The doctorates which Parry and Mackenzie had were honorary doctorates, not doctorates for which they'd studied. Not that Shaw would have treated them any more gently even if the doctorates had been studied for, quite the reverse. As for Professor Stanford, well, yes, Stanford really was a professor. But elsewhere, Shaw made it entirely plain what he thought of professors in general, and of this professor in particular. For Shaw, as for those profound intellectuals Andrew Bolt and Mark Latham on Sky News in our own time, having an academic qualification is in itself objectionable. 7 years after Shaw attacked Stanford's Eden, a younger critic, John F. Runciman, echoed Shaw in his impatience with Parry, Stanford and Mackenzie. Writing for the London Saturday Review, Runciman referred to George Marshall Hall's orchestral idyll thus, quote, "Many of last Saturday's audience must have felt that here was a work by one of the most truly original composers this country, i.e. England, has ever produced. A man simply miles above our Parrys, Stanfords, Mackenzies, and the rest." Unquote. Runciman must have been a hard fellow to please. In the same article, he dismissed Dvorak's New World Symphony as, quote, "one of the most hideous, disjointed, unmelodious achievements of the 19th century." Unquote. Elsewhere, Runciman referred to Dvorak as Hungarian, which suggests that some remedial lessons in European geography might have been in order for him. Almost half a century later, in 1943, Sir Arnold Bax, in his memoirs, spoke of the trio with similar condescension to Shaw and Runciman. Parry, Stanford, Mackenzie, they were all three solid, reputable citizens and ratepayers of the United Kingdom, model husbands and fathers without a doubt, respected members of the most irreproachably conservative clubs. Of this I am sure. And as late as 1991, we find Donald Burrows, best known for his work on Handel, insisting that, quote, "few of Stanford's, Parry's and Mackenzie's pieces survive the test of repeated hearings. Many display technical prowess that their musical inspiration cannot match." That's as may be, but what about the equation of Parry with Stanford and with no one else? It certainly hadn't happened by 1908, and I have some visual testimony to demonstrate this. In October of that year, the Illustrated London News published a laboriously produced composite portrait of Parry, Stanford, Mackenzie, and all of their best-known contemporaries. Best known in 1908, that is. A surprisingly large number of these figures have since been totally forgotten save among specialists, such as Sir Walter Parrott, doing his Jeremy Corbyn impersonation, and appropriately enough, sitting on the left. Also, Sir George Clement Martin, Sir Frederick Bridge, Sir Frederick Hyman Cowan, Percy Pitt, and William H. Cummings. Good luck waiting for their music to turn up at Hamer Hall, although Cowan did visit Melbourne for the 1888 City Centennial celebrations. Others among these figures have retained a kind of half-renown. Joseph Holbrook, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Dame Ethel Spythe, whose surname is misspelt, Sir Hamilton Harty, Sir Henry Walford Davies, Sir Granville Bantock, and Sir Edward German of Merry England fame. You can see Elgar there in the middle, with Mackenzie on his left and Stanford on his right. Parry is just behind Mackenzie. But again, no explicit Parry-Stanford linkage at all. So now, when did the linkage first take place? I'm disposed to believe that it was given its original impetus through the publication in 1934 of a book which the London critic J. A. Fuller Maitland devoted to both men. The Music of Parry and Stanford, an essay in comparative criticism, is the title of this book, and it turns out to be decidedly valuable. Educated in the Latin classics whilst at Westminster School, Fuller Maitland had studied Plutarch's parallel lives. He adopted a decidedly Plutarchian approach to his subjects, both of whom he had personally known well. During recent years, Fuller Maitland has incurred considerable ridicule for his lack of enthusiasm concerning cutting-edge post-1900 musical developments on the continent. But he had been among the earliest journalists shrewd enough to notice Parry's and Stanford's creative abilities in the first place. The very concept of the English musical renaissance, with everything that this implies, owes as much to Fuller Maitland as to any other single individual. And in his 1934 dual biography, Fuller Maitland shrewdly assesses each man's creative strengths and creative weaknesses. Unfortunately, once the practice of coupling Parry with Stanford had begun, for however worthwhile a motive, it proved hard, if not impossible, to stop. In the Manchester Guardian of 2nd of December 1937, we find Walter Legg, the future EMI record producer, using Elgar as a stick with which to beat the two other composers. Quote, "The clubs and cliques of English music never really liked Elgar. He was too professional for them. They preferred to rally round Parry and Stanford, who were socially gentlemen and musically amateurs." Unquote. So now Stanford, having been derided by the likes of Shaw and Runciman for excessive professionalism, is now to be derided for not being professional enough. He can't win. Jumping forward to 1954, we find a volume specifically aimed at the children's market, Going to a Concert by the English radio administrator, pianist and harpsichordist Lionel Salter, which was released by the Puffin imprint. Since this very volume was where I myself first learnt about the history of music, nearly 2 decades after it was first published, I hasten to add, I have a great deal of nostalgic fondness for the volume. But the other week I turned to its section on English music. In 1954, few writers living south of Hadrian's Wall were ever going to use the word British rather than English. And there I reminded myself of the fact that Lionel Salter consigns both Parry and Stanford to one paragraph. Here's the key passage. The lead in the revival of English music really came from 2 men, Parry and Stanford, who was an Irishman, though of course there were others who also helped. Like Glinka, these 2 are more important as influencers than as composers. Unquote. Note how by 1954 Mackenzie has somehow wandered off the reservation. Salter didn't feel the need to expend a single syllable on him. If you consult the World's Encyclopedia of Recorded Music, which appeared in 1952, you'll note that in this encyclopedia, the Mackenzie discography is non-existent, whereas Parry's discography amounts to half a page, and whereas Stanford's discography amounts to 2 pages. How much stylistic and historiographical justice is there in pairing Parry with Stanford? I argue, precious little. What few similarities existed between the 2 composers owed more to their social class and to chronology than to any alliance of temperaments. Both men came from the gentry, Parry having been born in 1848, Stanford in 1852. Both men were raised in an atmosphere of mild, dignified Anglican allegiance. Both men visited Bayreuth. Both men were trained as organists, though Parry abandoned the instrument fairly early in his adult life, whereas Stanford kept up his public organ playing at least until his early 40s. Both men knew Germany well at first hand, though Stanford spent rather more time on German soil than Parry did. Yet, even with these factors, for every outward likeness, there's at least one clear disparity. Stanford, as far as we can tell, remained faithful all his life to the Anglican creed of his upbringing. Parry didn't. His diaries chart a protracted and painful metamorphosis from his childhood Anglicanism to an idiosyncratic mixture of social gospel Christianity, Darwinism, Stoicism, and pantheism. In politics, Stanford, by instinct and by conscious conviction a Tory, detested Parry's identification with Gladstone liberalism's left wing. He referred to Parry behind the latter's back as the plutocratic radical. Even the 2 men's work methods were entirely divergent. From late adolescence, Stanford enjoyed an enviably fluent pen, whereas Parry, who lacked Stanford's child prodigy background, struggled mightily over almost every composition he wrote, as his diaries confirm. The hoary old legend of Parry churning out music without the smallest capacity for self-criticism should have been laid to rest ages ago. Yet the single greatest aesthetic contrast between Parry's outlook and Stanford's concerns opera. Stanford all his life adored opera. He desperately longed to be recognised as an opera composer before anything else. His early operas achieved a considerable following in German theatres, but the Great War killed off the memory of them even there, and in Britain only one opera of Stanford's, Seamus O'Brien, attained more than fleeting popular approval. Earlier in 2019, it so happens, the UK witnessed revivals of two Stanford operas, Much Ado About Nothing and The Travelling Companion. A third Stanford opera, The Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, has just been given at Wexford in Ireland. But Parry's attitude towards opera was altogether more agonised and self-lacerating than Stanford's. Whilst Parry, like Stanford, produced music for productions of stage plays, he attempted only one opera, that was Guinevere, dating from the 1880s, and a heavily Wagnerian treatment of Arthurian legend. The consensus of Parry's scholars is that the libretto of Guinevere was an absolute turkey, and so it is, to judge by published extracts from it, though worse librettos are often attached to operas that have become popular hits. Reading between the lines of Parry's diaries and his correspondence with Guinevere's librettist, Una Taylor, one obtains the decided impression that Parry couldn't stand her libretto, but that he might have had something of a crush on her personally until their eventual falling out. I must admit it's in the highest degree unlikely that such a crush, supposing it ever occurred, had the slightest physical manifestation. After all, any hint of extramarital yearning on Parry's part would have brought with it singularly terrible retribution from his wife, Lady Maud Parry, who was very much the hyacinth bucket of the operation, and who, as a daughter of the Earl of Pembroke no less, treated her husband with the same genial contempt that Hyacinth showed to the hapless Richard. What I find particularly notable is Parry's change of heart when it became obvious that Guinevere was never going to achieve a staging in his lifetime. As late as 1918, Parry continued to brood about this failure. In that year, he confided to his diary the following, quote, "Opera is the shallowest fraud ever achieved in the name of art. Its invariable associates are dirt and tinsel. Its history is falseness, intrigue, shallowness, levity, and pretension. It is the appanage of the wastrels, the home of humbugs. No composer who is worthy of any reverence at all ever wrote an opera," unquote. Having thus consigned to outer darkness Monteverdi, Purcell, Lully, Charpentier, Rameau, Vivaldi, Handel, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Cherubini, Meyerbeer, Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, Weber, Schubert, Schumann, Wagner, Verdi, Puccini, Gounod, Saint-Saëns, Bizet, Massenet, Debussy, Ravel, Mussorgsky, Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, Tchaikovsky, Smetana, Offenbach, Johann Strauss, Richard Strauss, and indeed Stanford, with apologies for any omissions, Parry forces his readers to ask this question: would he have thus condemned the whole operatic genre if Guinevere had been granted a performance? I doubt it. Stanford found Parry's wrath against opera completely incomprehensible. He found likewise incomprehensible Parry's justified rage on discovering that the cash-strapped Stanford had taken to cheating the Royal College of Music by invoicing it for lessons that he had never actually given. Relations between the two composers were eventually patched up to a certain extent through Lady Stanford's peacemaking officers. But if Parry hadn't died in 1918, I'm sure that he and Stanford would have had a screaming match over something else. At any rate, Parry's death induced in Stanford a certain amount of survivor guilt over the bad relations which had existed between the two men. 4 years afterwards, Stanford paid to Parry a tribute in the form of a prelude for organ, based on a very early song of Parry's, called Why Does Azure Deck the Sky? The result doesn't sound remotely like Parry, and it doesn't sound much like what we think of as typical Stanford either. It has much more in common with Franck and with the organ pieces of such Franck students as Louis Vierne. Certain modulations even hint at Reger's example. In conclusion, by now I trust I've conveyed my belief that the pairing of Parry with Stanford is a trope that long ago passed its use-by date. I'd like to see it discarded, along with the Shaw-generated myth of both men as anti-Elgar conspirators. It slights the achievements of both men when the music of one is used to belittle the music of the other, and it slights the achievements of both men still more when historians consign them to a cul-de-sac that jeopardizes our understanding of wider European musical developments. I'd like to leave you now with an aphorism from Goethe, which appears in the introduction to Fuller Maitland's book. Goethe told Schiller, "People are always quarrelling over which of us is the finer poet. They would do far better to give thanks that they have both of us." In a similar spirit, I find myself giving thanks that we have both Stanford and Parry. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much.